When a homeless man asked Mark Zuckerberg for just $1, no one could have predicted the life-changing response that followed. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another special story for you. Mark Zuckerberg walked down a quiet alley in San Francisco, the late afternoon sun casting golden streaks over the uneven pavement. His hoodie was pulled up, his face down, lost in thought. The noise of the bustling city faded as he wandered into a quieter street. He had just left an intense board meeting where every decision was dissected, every move questioned. Mark felt trapped in a cycle of power and wealth, searching for something he couldn't name. He needed to clear his mind. Near the corner, a man sat on the cold concrete, his figure blending into the shadows. His clothes were worn and mismatched, his hair tangled and streaked with gray. He held a piece of cardboard scrawled with uneven handwriting. Not much, just $1. The man, likely in his late 40s, had a distant gaze, as if he was staring past the world that ignored him. As Mark walked past, the man spoke, his voice low but steady. "Hey, got $1?" Mark froze mid-step, the unexpected question breaking his train of thought. He turned slowly, his piercing eyes meeting the man's tired but defiant gaze. Mark didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crouched down, bringing himself to the man's level. "Why just $1?" Mark asked, his voice curious but calm. The man chuckled dryly, a hollow sound that hinted at years of disappointment. "Because $1's all anyone will give without thinking twice, enough to remind me I still exist." Mark studied him for a moment, his sharp mind calculating, analyzing. But something in this man's honesty unsettled him. This wasn't about money. It was about being seen. "What's your name?" Mark asked, his tone softening. "Jacob," the man replied, pulling his tattered jacket tighter around himself. "Just Jacob." Mark nodded, his thoughts racing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. Jacob's eyes flickered with anticipation, but Mark paused, staring at the single dollar he held. Then, without handing it over, he stood up and said, "Come with me." Jacob blinked, confused. "What? Where?" Mark smiled faintly, his expression unreadable. "Just trust me." Jacob frowned, glancing around nervously. "Look, man, if this is some kind of joke—" "It's not," Mark interrupted. His voice was firm but not forceful. "I want to help, but not with $1. Come on." Jacob hesitated, his instincts screaming to stay put. But something about Mark's demeanor, the quiet confidence, the sincerity in his eyes, made him stand up. "All right," Jacob muttered. "But if this gets weird, I'm out." Mark led him to a sleek black car parked nearby. The driver opened the door and Mark gestured for Jacob to get in. Jacob stared at the car, his reflection distorted in the polished surface. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice wary. "You'll see," Mark replied simply, sliding into the seat. The car ride was silent at first, the cityscape blurring past the windows. Jacob shifted uncomfortably, his hands clutching his knees. He glanced at Mark, who stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable. "So, what's the deal?" Jacob finally asked. "You're not just some guy with $1, are you?" Mark smirked faintly but didn't answer right away. Instead, he asked, "What do you do, Jacob? Or what did you do before?" Jacob scoffed. "Before? I used to fix things. Anything electrical, wiring, circuits, you name it. But that was a lifetime ago." Mark's eyes flickered with interest. "And now?" Jacob gestured vaguely at the city outside. "Now? I sit on corners asking for $1. Guess I'm not very good at it." The car slowed as they approached a large industrial building on the city's edge. Its modern design was stark against the older brick structures surrounding it. "We're here," Mark said, stepping out and motioning for Jacob to follow. Jacob hesitated again, staring at the imposing building. "What is this place?" Mark turned to him, his expression serious. "It's a chance." Jacob frowned but followed Mark inside. The air was cool, the interior filled with rows of workstations and high-tech equipment. People moved around purposefully, their heads buried in screens and schematics. Jacob felt out of place, like a ghost walking through someone else's world. Mark led him to a small room with a table and 2 chairs. "Sit," he said, gesturing to one of the chairs. Jacob sat, his posture defensive. "All right, Zuckerberg, What's your game? Mark sat across from him, leaning forward slightly. No game. Just an idea. You said you used to fix things. I want to see if you still can. Jacob's brow furrowed. What are you talking about? Mark reached into a bag and pulled out a small disassembled circuit board. Prove it, he said, sliding the board across the table. Fix this. Jacob stared at the board, his hands twitching slightly. Are you serious? Mark nodded. Completely. Jacob hesitated, his mind flooded with doubt. It had been years since he'd touched anything like this, but something in Mark's gaze pushed him forward. Slowly he picked up the board, his fingers tracing the circuits. All right, he muttered. Let's see if I've still got it. As Jacob worked, Mark watched silently, his mind spinning with possibilities. Somewhere deep down he felt this was about more than just fixing a circuit. It was about fixing something in himself. Jacob's hands moved instinctively as if they had been waiting years for this moment. His fingers traced the circuit board's pathways, identifying what was wrong with quiet precision. A soldering iron sat nearby on the table, along with a small tray of tools. Jacob glanced at Mark, who simply nodded, his expression calm but expectant. With a deep breath, Jacob picked up the iron, his movements slow and deliberate. He began replacing a damaged connection, his hands steady despite the weight of years spent away from his craft. For a moment the room was silent except for the faint hum of the iron. Mark watched intently, his curiosity growing. You've done this before, he said quietly, almost to himself. Jacob didn't look up. 15 years, he murmured. I used to be the guy people called when they couldn't figure out what went wrong. Circuits, wiring, machinery, you name it. Then one day, well, life had other plans. Mark tilted his head slightly, sensing the layers beneath Jacob's words. What happened? Jacob hesitated, his hands pausing briefly over the board. Doesn't matter now, he said gruffly. That's the past. Mark leaned back, studying Jacob's face. Sometimes the past has a funny way of catching up with the present. Jacob didn't respond. He focused on finishing the repair, his mind flashing back to the garage he used to work in. The laughter of his co-workers, the satisfaction of solving problems that no one else could. It felt like another lifetime, one that slipped away when everything else fell apart. Finally, he set the soldering iron down and inspected his work. There, he said, pushing the board back toward Mark. Try it. Mark picked up the circuit board, examining it with a careful eye. Then he pulled out a small device from his pocket, attaching the board to it. A moment later, a small green light blinked to life. Jacob exhaled, a mixture of relief and disbelief washing over him. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he thought he'd lost. Pride. Not bad, Mark said, a small smile tugging at his lips. Still got it, huh? Jacob shrugged, trying to mask his satisfaction. Just muscle memory. Mark set the device down and leaned forward. Jacob, I've got a project. Something big. I'm building a platform to help people like you, people with skills, potential, but who've been pushed aside by life. I want you to be part of it. Jacob blinked, stunned. You're kidding, right? I don't kid about this kind of thing, Mark said firmly. You know how to fix things. That's a skill most people don't have. I need someone who understands what it's like to be on the outside looking in. Someone who can help me build something real. Jacob leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. And what's the catch? No catch, Mark replied. Just one condition. You put in the work. This isn't charity. You'll have to prove yourself every step of the way. Jacob stared at him, his mind racing. The weight of his failures and regrets pressed heavily on his chest, but for the first time in years he saw a door opening. A chance, not just for a better life, but to feel like himself again. Before Jacob could respond, the door to the room opened. A woman stepped in, her polished appearance and sharp gaze making it clear she wasn't here for pleasantries. Mark, she said, her tone clipped. The board is asking questions. They're concerned about this. She glanced at Jacob, her expression unreadable. Mark didn't flinch. Let them ask. I'll handle it. The woman's gaze lingered on Jacob for a moment before she turned back to Mark. You'd better. This could blow up in your face. It won't, Mark said, his voice steady, because it's the right thing to do. The woman left, closing the door behind her. Jacob exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in the air. "She's got a point," Jacob said cautiously. "What if this does blow up in your face? What if I screw up?" Mark smiled faintly, his eyes meeting Jacob's. "Then we'll fix it. Together." Jacob stared at him, the words sinking in. Slowly, he nodded. "All right, let's do this." Mark extended his hand and Jacob shook it firmly. In that moment, something shifted, a small but undeniable step forward, for both of them. As they left the room, Mark glanced back at the repaired circuit board on the table. $1, he murmured to himself, a small smile playing on his lips. Who knew? Jacob didn't hear him, but the look of determination on his face said enough. The next few days were a whirlwind for Jacob. Mark brought him back to the warehouse, introducing him to a small team working on what he called Project Rebuild. It wasn't just another tech initiative. It was a platform designed to connect people with overlooked skills to opportunities that matched their expertise. For Mark, it wasn't about charity. It was about creating a system that gave people like Jacob the tools to rebuild their lives. Jacob was given a desk, tools, and a laptop. But most importantly, he was given trust, something he hadn't felt in years. The first task was simple: design a small prototype for an automated electrical diagnostic tool. For someone like Jacob, it should have been easy, but his confidence wavered. Years of self-doubt crept into his mind, but he pushed forward, determined not to waste this chance. The first day was rough. His hands trembled as he worked, and every mistake felt like a reminder of how far he had fallen. But Mark was patient, stopping by occasionally to check on him, offering quiet encouragement. "Don't worry about speed," Mark said one evening as he watched Jacob fumble with a set of wires. "Get it right first, confidence comes later." Jacob nodded, swallowing his frustration. It wasn't just about fixing wires anymore. It was about fixing himself. Word of Mark's new project began leaking to the media. Headlines like "Mark Zuckerberg's radical experiment with the homeless" and "PR stunt or genuine mission" started circulating. Paparazzi swarmed the warehouse, hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious homeless engineer who had become the face of the project. Inside, Jacob tried to ignore the noise. But one afternoon, he stumbled across a headline on a coworker's screen. "Can a former homeless man save Zuckerberg's latest venture?" The article detailed his past, his fall from grace, the accusations of embezzlement, and his time on the streets. Jacob froze. He had worked so hard to move forward, but here was his past, dragged out into the open for the world to see. "What's wrong?" Mark's voice cut through Jacob's thoughts. He had approached quietly, noticing the tension in Jacob's posture. Jacob pointed at the screen. "They're tearing me apart out there." Mark glanced at the article, his jaw tightening. "That's what they do," he said calmly. "They look for the cracks because it's easier than seeing the whole picture." Jacob shook his head, his frustration spilling over. "You don't get it. They'll never let me move on. No matter what I do, I'll always be the guy who failed." Mark studied him for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "You're right. I don't get it. Not entirely. But here's what I do know. The only way they win is if you give up. So, what's it going to be, Jacob?" Jacob didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands, calloused and scarred, the hands of someone who had fought battles no one else could see. Slowly, he nodded. "All right, let's keep going." Mark smiled faintly. "Good. Now, I've got something else I need your help with." The following day, Mark called Jacob into his office holding a sleek tablet. "I've been thinking about how to make this project bigger," Mark began. "It's not just about giving people jobs, it's about changing the way society sees them." Jacob frowned. "What do you mean?" Mark tapped the screen, showing a prototype of the platform they were building. "We're going to showcase stories, real stories of people who've overcome, people like you. But I need your help to make it authentic, no polished PR spin, just the truth." Jacob hesitated. "You want me to tell my story, like all of it?" Mark nodded. "People need to see the person behind the skills, the struggles, the wins, the losses. It's the only way to break the cycle of judgment." Jacob stared at the screen, the weight of the request pressing down on him, but deep down he knew Mark was right. "All right," he said finally. "But if we're doing this, we're doing it my way. No sugarcoating." Mark smiled. "That's exactly what I want." Over the next week, Jacob worked on both the platform and his story. He sat down with a camera, nervously at first, but as he spoke, the words began to flow. He talked about his wife, his job, and the choices that had led him to the streets. He didn't hold back, sharing his pain, his regrets, but also his hope for what lay ahead. When the first video was uploaded to the platform, it went viral almost instantly. The comments poured in, some supportive, others skeptical, but one stood out to Jacob. "I thought I was the only one who felt like this. Thank you for giving me hope." Jacob stared at the screen, his chest tight. For the first time, he felt like his story wasn't just a burden, it was a tool to help others. But not everyone was thrilled about the platform's success. Behind closed doors, a faction within Mark's company grew restless, worried that this experiment would damage the company's reputation. And somewhere in the shadows, a familiar face was plotting his next move. Richard wasn't done yet. Redemption isn't just about rebuilding yourself. It's about using your story to lift others up. Even the smallest step forward can create ripples of hope. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring tales.